Hello, my name is Dr. Nick Bowman, and I'm an associate professor in journalism and creative media industries here at Texas Tech University. And I was talking with Christina Genet and about your course on interactive media. And I was reminded of a presentation that I gave not too long ago to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention here in the United States on how video games have matured as a storytelling narrative. And so I thought it'd be an opportunity to go over that presentation with you today. So apologize in advance for the older date on this one. I know I'm kind of recycling an old presentation, but I thought that it'd be really cool for the students at Texas Tech to see some of the research we're doing here at Tech. And also, I hope you forgive the hat. I haven't had a haircut in about 6 months. So I'm in quarantine like the rest of you, and I thought I would just get cozy and talk. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So one of the really important things that you need to know about media broadly is that we definitely use media to tell stories. And we've been doing this for a very, very long time. Now, if you were to think about serious media today, one that comes to mind immediately is film, right? There are lots of examples of movies that have told really serious stories. Maybe you've seen films like Schindler's List or Hotel Rwanda or Life is Beautiful, and those are just Western examples. And I'm sure you can think of others where you watched a story and it really meant a lot to you personally. For me, it was the movie Glory with Matthew Broderick about one of the only African-American regiments in the Civil War. Well, if you were to go back and talk to directors back in the 1800s about whether or not film could be a serious storytelling medium, they would have laughed at you. As you see on your screen right now, you know, some of the earliest films were barely anything more than technological demonstrations. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Muybridge videos, but this was a man who basically was trying to win a bet as to whether or not when a horse runs, how many of its feet leave the ground. And so he found a way to take rapid images of a horse, flip those images very quickly, and what you see on screen is one of the very first movies of all time. If you watch it really closely, sure enough, you'll see at some point, I think on slide 5 or 6, the actual all 4 feet of a horse leave the ground. Hence, horses kind of fly when they run, right? We went from just showing off things, you know, there's other movies of trains and factories and people walking around, and movies or moving images were just a way to take pictures, make them move, and it wasn't much more than that. I don't know if anyone recognizes the movie in the center, but it's a film called White Christmas with Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye. It's a very famous Christmas movie, and if anybody's ever seen it, it's a song and dance musical, very reminiscent of entertainment at the turn of the 20th century. You go to a stage, you dance, you sing, everybody enjoys it, and then you move on. And so all movies were doing were taking stage shows and then replicating them. And I don't know if anyone recognizes the film on the far edge of the screen here under extension, but what you see here is something very important to the development of film. You have scenes cut back and forth to each other. This was a movie called Battleship Potemkin, and it's about an emerging war in Far Eastern Europe. And what they do is by showing this baby rolling down the stairs and this woman screaming at the top of the stairs, you develop this tension, and clearly something's going on and she's terrified for her child. Well, that is when films started learning how to tell stories differently than Broadway and differently than just taking pictures of things. In other words, media tend to follow evolutions. They go from just technological demonstrations to replicating whatever's already out there. And then after 30, 40, 50 years, film directors learned how to tell serious stories with the medium, like you see in the image on top of me there. Well, video games followed something kind of similar. The earliest games were just technical demonstrations. This is a game called Space War, where the needle and the wedge, you have to navigate them around a gravity well, and you're trying to shoot the other spaceship. You see an image of that game right here. This came out in the early 60s, not too surprising. It came out of the Cold War when we were thinking about computing equipment and space and war. And in fact, many people think that the game was basically just sort of inspired by a lot of the early research into computing technologies. And all video games were in the 60s were ways to sort of show off how powerful a computer can be. And then, of course, we move into more classic games like Super Mario Brothers, which is basically just replicating an old story, saving the princess from danger, and you have a male hero, and he battles the dragon and saves the princess. And we can definitely talk about some of the, the gender norms built into that story. But in a way, that's the point, right? Earliest games weren't all that creative with their storytelling. In some ways, the story was just kind of an excuse to play the game. In this case here, really, if you've played Mario, it's jumping around on things and getting coins and avoiding monsters. Well, and then video games got a little more serious. And you have the game BioShock, for example, where suddenly you run into characters in the game that might need your help. And you can decide if you want to help them or not. You can involve yourself in the narrative, and you can make, moral decisions about who lives and who dies. And of course, certainly that's not a new thing in terms of storytelling. But the difference is, unlike a film or a book or a TV show or anything else before video games, in a video game, you get to make the decisions yourself, which means that you have to live with the consequences, and you might have a bit more ownership over the content. And that's something that games are only recently starting to do in terms of telling serious narratives or meaningful narratives. If we look at the screen here, maybe you recognize Zelda, and maybe I'm just revealing my age right now. But what happens on this screen is going to be different for everybody watching this video. It kind of depends on, well, which direction do you go in, right? 3 of the directions are going to get you killed because you're going to walk in and there's going to be monsters that come after you. But if you're smart, you'll go into that door first, pick up a weapon, and then you can progress through the narrative and cut down monsters along the way. So I hope you grabbed the sword. Those of you who did are surviving. Those of you who didn't and just went on about your business may have gotten eaten or shot at pretty quickly. And that's different than other non-interactive narratives because you can't do anything to influence what's happening to other people. Video games, of course, one of the things they're probably the most well-known for is violence and gore, right? So, funny enough, the earliest games weren't that violent at all. But if you go back to 1976, there was a very famous game called called Death Race, where you drive this car around and you chase these little gremlins here and here, right? And every time you knocked over a gremlin, they make a headstone. And so you got points every time you killed a gremlin. And if you played this game in arcades, it actually had a steering wheel and a gas and brake pedal. And people were terrified by this because basically it's a murder simulator. Now, funny enough, in the 70s, there was a movie called Death Race, which if you haven't watched it, it's on YouTube in its entirety. Sit down, grab your favorite beverage, and watch that movie for a couple hours. It's amazing. Now, the movie involved cars running over people, and it was kind of like a dystopian look into a future capitalist society in which, businesses run the show, and it's kind of your famous sci-fi dystopian tale. The video game sort of removed all those things and just said, run over people, or gremlins, as they called it. Maybe you've played Mortal Kombat, where you pull, people's hearts out and take a bite and shove it up in the air after you beat them up. Or maybe the game Manhunt, where you actually grab the controllers in your hands and you swipe them around. And if you grab a sword and cut it like this, your character will actually cut into the neck of a real person on screen, right? And so games have this, violent streak to them, of course. And that's something that I think that tends to be all we ever think about and talk about. And I'm going to challenge that a little bit when it comes to storytelling, because you can do more than this, and you can do things like what's on screen, and it can actually matter for storytelling. For example, we've seen advances in motion capture technology, where suddenly gamers are much more interested in seeing emotion. So on the one side of the screen, we're just motion capturing people's movements, or their below the neck verbs, which is probably more relevant to action and moving and jumping and shooting. But we're also seeing video games map above the neck verbs, smiles, and nonverbal communications, which shouldn't really matter for gameplay. Who cares if my character is smiling or frowning while it shoots somebody? Well, that might matter as we start to make more serious, more meaningful, and more deep narratives in video games. We know, for example, that when people play video games, they don't just turn off their moral intuitions. In my own research, I found that when players enter a video game world and they do something in the world that's immoral, they feel guilt. They respond to that differently. And oftentimes they will avoid doing things that are bad. So if you're somebody, for example, and harm is really important to you, you don't like to hurt people, you're probably not going to hurt people in the video game either. Unless, of course, the game makes you or requires you to, right? It's hard to imagine a fighting game where you don't punch people. Folks don't just steal things in video games, but then not steal things in real life. That doesn't mean nobody does it. In fact, one of the fun things about video games is you can sort of practice and play with different aspects of your morality, and you can also see the consequences of those decisions. But in the research on screen here, what we actually found, for example, is that when somebody had a really strong salience towards a particular type of morality, for example, harm or fairness, they would not violate that in the video game. If they had the option not to hurt somebody or not to steal from somebody, they wouldn't do it in the game because they wouldn't do it in real life. And that's interesting when we think about violence, because it might suggest not everybody is necessarily being aggressive. We've also seen people play a video game, do something that they think is morally wrong, and then they feel bad about it later, and they reflect on it, and they wonder if it was the right thing to do. So we've seen studies where people will shoot innocents, like in an airport, for example, or in a video game where you're told those people are innocent, they're unarmed, and then you've got a weapon in your hand and you shoot them anyway. And after gameplay, they feel guilty about it. And it makes them sort of question who they are and why they did that. And if they were to do that again, how would they behave in that situation? You may have heard of the No Russians level from the game Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. And this is the game where you grabbed a weapon, and in this one level you joined a terrorist cell, and they just opened fire on a bunch of innocent travelers. And there's a lot of YouTube videos like the guy on screen here where folks watch that video for the first time or play that game level for the first time, and they kind of freak out and they're like, I'm absolutely shocked, I'm horrified. This game took a lot of heat for being gratuitous, but the ironic thing here is that we see this all the time in movies and films. Schindler's List was a very graphic movie that it was meant to sort of get your attention and make you think about the atrocities of the Holocaust. Saving Private Ryan, it was not a film celebrating war. It's a film very much showing the cost of war. And in some ways, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is kind of the same way. The developers often said, we designed this level because we just wanted you to feel something for a change. You've been shooting stuff for decades, and now we want you to actually feel guilty for it. And the level was critiqued for lots of reasons, and one of them was that it was a bit clumsy. But it's an interesting way of using interactive violence to tell a story that isn't just an entertainment story, but it actually might be a story that's meant to be a bit more reflective. Again, this isn't the best example, but it's an example of what can happen with interactive storytelling. At some point, the player has to pull the trigger, right? The game doesn't make you pull the trigger, but you did, and you shot people, and now you feel guilty about that. And the research shows the same. We've seen that video games tend to be more than just arousal and aggression. So I did a study a couple of years ago, a series of studies surveying and interviewing gamers, and we found that, not surprising, like 99% of the gamers we interviewed could remember a fun experience gaming. But it turns out about 3/4 of gamers we interviewed and surveyed also could recall having a meaningful or serious reaction to a video game. And what they were talking about often was reflecting on the actions on screen and their moral weights, whether or not those things were real or not. They talked a lot about having connections with the characters or connections with the people they played with, so gaming was helping them understand their family better. What we're sort of getting at here is that there was a lot of deep engagement with the story, and in particular, meaningful games tended to be rated very high in terms of story, which tended to make people feel very related to the characters and feel more insightful into themselves. And those things tended to lead to having more appreciation. If you look here, gameplay has nothing to do with any of this. It's not that gameplay is not important, but gameplay may not be as relevant for appreciation. Video games are more than just their buttons and their controllers. There's also the interactive narrative. One of the things I write about and research extensively is the notion that gamers are often co-authors of the experience. Go back to that Zelda example. Everybody picks up that controller is going to play a little bit differently, and we're going to have a little bit of a different experience as a result. And maybe y'all can think of things like sandbox games where there aren't any rules and you can kind of go wherever you want to. And the variance in people's experiences there gets really big really quickly. And by the way, if anybody here is interested in talking more about this, whether it's writing video games or researching video games, this is the research I do at Texas Tech. So please email me. My Twitter handle's on there. I'll give you my email on the last slide. We know that games are a source of nostalgia. People can play video games and look back on their past and think about their past selves and how it relates to their future selves. We know that games trigger emotions far above and beyond just aggression. And again, getting into the idea that video games can be a serious form of storytelling because the player is directly involved in co-authoring and telling the story itself, right? We know that players, when they're playing video games, also tend to form these really deep social relationships with their avatars, the characters that are on screen. And interesting enough, that becomes another story. So just like following a movie with your favorite character, now you've got a video game with your favorite avatar, except that avatar might be you, and it's your experiencing the action directly. Or sometimes what happens is you're not actually the avatar, you're helping the avatar get through its story world to where, believe it or not, even though you're the one playing the game, the avatar is kind of in charge, and you're sort of, understanding its world, understanding its needs, trying to make gameplay decisions to keep the avatar healthy and to make sure it gets what it needs and gets what it wants. It's almost like your avatar becomes a pet. Anybody who's ever played The Sims or Tamagotchi knows what I'm talking about. And there's all sorts of ways to go about this. And then there's the object players who, for them, their avatar is just a bunch of pixels and they're just playing the game to win. And that doesn't mean it's a illegitimate or a bad video gaming experience, but they may have a different type of motivation. They may not be as motivated in storytelling as people who see the avatar as themselves or see the avatar as something else. And I realize I'm going very quickly through these individual presentations, but I'm happy to talk with anybody about these papers in detail. I've written parts of all of this past research. And so finally, one of the last things we can think about here is that what makes video games particularly interesting as narrative devices is they demand so much of the player. I've already said several times that gaming is sort of a co-authored experience between the player and the content on screen. And we have to engage that content. Cognitively, we have to think through it. Emotionally, we have to feel through it. Physically, we have to actually grab the controllers themselves and do something with them. And that could be, just pushing the buttons and making sure we kind of understand how the controller feels. Many of you may have a hard time explaining to somebody else how to play a video game because to you, the controller is so transparent. You don't know which button does what because it's all muscle memory, right? Another type of demand is like the exertional demand of just moving around and moving quickly and having the eye-hand coordination and having the stamina. And if you've ever used like a 3D game, it could be even more so. There's just so much more going on. And then finally, social demand. There's the people around you. There's the characters themselves. There's your own personal needs. And all of these things have to be balanced for you to tell the story that you want to tell within the constraints of the system. And as a writer for video games, how do you give the player the ability to balance and make changes and decisions to balance, to make sure they can handle the demands? Games are popular and they arrest our attention. And for narrative storytellers, this very much works in our favor because now we're able to step back and think about how the players are going to take up this experience in ways that could be more meaningful. And it doesn't mean, again, that you can't just make fun games. There's nothing wrong with telling a fun, basic, enjoyable story. Just like I love, a comedy as much as everybody else. But you can also tell those more serious stories. And I think people are just now realizing that video games, because they would command so much of our attention and demand so much of our time, they can also tell those stories. My contact information is on this slide. I'm the head of the Interaction Lab, the TTUIX Lab. Email me at any time. I'm always looking to work with students and talk to them about narrative research and gaming and player psychology. You can tweet me as well. Again, I appreciate you letting me talk about kind of an older presentation, but giving it to the CDC was really neat, but nobody saw that presentation outside that closed room. And so it's kind of cool to be able to share this information with our tech students and let everybody know that your faculty, when they're not teaching these classes, are out there trying to find this research. I'm going to go to the last couple slides. I'm just going to leave the video on for about 5 seconds so you can get any of the citations you need. And if you want to talk about any of this stuff, hit me up. Let's chat. Okay? Wreck 'em.